This video makes me question why I tried to join the Air Force once upon a time. We're back on track with the F-4 Phantom, and before now I was worried about making too many Phantom videos, but that really isn't the case anymore because you guys' general response to the idea of more Phantom has generally just been,
well, threaten me with a good time.
And with the addition of the gun pod and the F-4Ds to the Air Force ranks, that was also pretty much the attitude of the US going into 1968, and, well, we mostly know how that turned out. The Navy and the Air Force would both get new Phantom models delivered to the Vietnam theater in 1968. The Navy would be the first to get their new toys early that year when a single squadron of F-4Js was delivered to theater, and considering the new version first flew in May of 1966, it might seem a little weird that they only sent one. Thanks to one of my Twitch viewers, I found out they wanted to field test the new, more advanced air-to-air tech to determine whether or not the new J model was actually ready for combat. If the new variant was up to par, they'd send more. If it wasn't, they wouldn't. The J model was an upgraded F-4B for the US Navy and Marine Corps, meant exclusively to let the MiGs know that if they didn't have a plot pick, they were going to have one picked for them. The F-4J's upgrades included slotted tailplanes, more powerful engines, upgraded avionics and ground attack systems like a ballistic computer, and drooping ailerons and slotted tailplanes. Let me explain both those last two real quick. First, the drooping ailerons basically double as flaps. All they really do is change the resting angle of the aileron to be slightly down during takeoff and landing, but this allows them to function as flaps. This lowered its takeoff and landing speeds, which, as you might guess, is pretty important for carrier ops. It lets you land slower, and more lift also means more takeoff weight, which translates to leaving home with even more bad guy to baloney technology at the time. It's just science. Meanwhile, the slotted tailplanes are basically just mini highway guardrails stuck to the front edge of the frowny face tail. These allow air to flow from the top of the tail to the bottom when you pull back hard on the stick, helping to smooth out the airflow on the bottom edge and reducing flow separation, which helps with the whole bleeding speed like a vampire problem. But the biggest upgrades on the J model were countermeasures dispensers and look-down radar. The countermeasure dispensers let the aircraft decoy missiles fired at it by MiG-21s and SAM sites, but the radar was where it's at. The radar on the J model Phantoms had what's called look-down capability, and it's called that because it's literally what the radar does. It has the signal processing to routinely look down into ground clutter, allowing it to pick out targets flying at lower altitudes, meaning that the low-flying MiGs that had been evading Phantom detection up to this point could be picked up by the J, and it could consequently pre-fire the MiGs like you're trying to piss off sweatlords in an FPS game.
Did he just pre-fire me? Bro, go to jail.
And a lot of the Navy's toys would transfer over to the Air Force's new Phantom that they picked up in late '68. The F-4E would finally enter the fight, and it wasn't based on the design of the F-4C or the F-4D, but on the RF-4C. And I'm gonna go on a bit of a tangent here because the RF-4C is way scarier than most people think. This is a tactical all-weather reconnaissance plane that first flew on May 18, 1964, and because this plane is a flying photography booth, it wasn't made to carry weapons, with one exception. The centerline pylon could still mount a tactical nuke. I'm surprised the Soviets weren't more scared of this thing because this wasn't a recon plane, it was a nuclear sniper rifle. You don't need intel or papers or any of that kind of crap to tell your pilots where to put the nuke because your pilots can reach out and find where to put the nuke. This plane turns next day shipping into next hour shipping. To God. If a startup delivery company showed up with a fleet of these tomorrow, the only reason they would still call it next day shipping is to keep flashing the smug mug at Amazon. This is peak logistical efficiency. Forget search and destroy, this is search and remap. Because if you even see this thing in your area, you're going to want a cartographer on speed dial. Not to mention the best you're going to be able to do is pray that guy's not in the blast radius. Because you can't figure out where they're going to put the nuke if they don't know where they're going to put the nuke. America is literally going to nuke you on the fly, and then it'll take a selfie with your remains like it's Logan Paul because pics or it didn't happen. Honestly, I can't tell if this is psychological warfare or economic warfare, because if one of these rolled up into Soviet airspace, I don't think their economy can handle producing enough new pants for all their grunts. Which is the end result I imagine happened when some of them actually did show up, during Project Dark Gene in 1973. Iran was providing support and plausible deniability to the US while they were playing the Intelligence Expansion DLC for the Wild Weasel missions. Basically, the US was sending RF-4Cs over the Soviet Union and deliberately activating SAM batteries to gather intelligence on the frequencies they used. The Soviets would send up MiG-21s to intercept, but only one Phantom actually went down because of it, and it wasn't even a Soviet win in the process. The MiG-21 in question missed with both of his K-13 heat-seeking missiles, and his gun jammed after firing one round. Your Honor, I rest my case on the quality of Soviet engineering. So when ground control told him to knock it down at any cost, the only option he had left was to ram it. So he did. But I'm getting sidetracked here. Where was I? So the RF-4C was the plane they used as a basis for the F-4E, which they then bolted on a bunch of dogfighting upgrades. The Phantom E got most of the J's slew of performance upgrades with better engines, the slotted tailplanes, and the addition of leading-edge slats. The leading-edge slats basically increased the wing area and improved maximum angle of attack, letting a Phantom pilot pitch up more than normal during a fight and get the nose around a little faster. However, it's important not to do what I used to do and confuse this with turn rate, which remain the same. Honestly, adding a bonus to your angle of attack is a lot like adding a bonus to your damage rolls in Dungeons & Dragons rather than upgrading your damage dice. The damage dice would be the turn rate, the damage bonus would be your angle of attack boost. And on top of that, the Phantom E upgraded the radar to a smaller and more powerful model, so all those close-range upgrades didn't even compromise on long-range firepower. They basically took the nuke sniper and strapped on a bayonet lug. Now you can delete someone from next door, next postal code, or next continent. Pick your poison. But the most hotly debated choice was the addition of an M61 Vulcan 20mm cannon in place of the recon equipment. Now, if you ask me, I'd take the gun over the missile any day. Missiles you can decoy. You're not decoying a bullet. That thing's just gonna look at you and go,
Pikachu, I choose you!
But a lot of people argue that the gun didn't make much of a difference because the Phantom only scored 10 kills with it between its introduction and the end of Rolling Thunder. However, I raise you the fact that by the end of Operation Rolling Thunder in October of '68, F-4 Phantoms had only scored 70 kills total. 10 kills is still millions of dollars of equipment down the drain, and a 14% contribution to the war doesn't exactly scream insignificant to me. However, despite all the improvements made to the Phantoms over the course of the year, and that one Phantom that landed in November after taking a SAM hit without a backseater because the pilot panic ordered the guy to eject before realizing the plane could still fly. Whoops. By the time 1968 had come to an end, the Americans were stuck with the losing end of the KD ratio. They only had 5 MiG kills scored to 18 US losses, and by the end of Rolling Thunder, the US had lost a total of 531 aircraft and 547 airmen, primarily to ground fire. But the US didn't wait until the operation was over. The Navy had already effectively rage quit the match by July to go do a VOD review. Nearly 600 missiles were fired in around 360 air-to-air engagements between the 17th of June in 1965 and the 17th of September of 1968 by both the Navy and the Air Force, and they had the worst report card you had ever seen, with an 8.2% in AIM-7 Sparrow, a 10.7% in the AIM-4 Falcon, and a 16% in the AIM-9 Sidewinder. These grades were so bad that the only way they were going to get better was if Dad showed up and started chewing out Uncle Sam, and along with multiple studies on Phantom performance like the Sparrow shoot investigation by the Air Force in '67, and the Red Baron study, which wasn't done until '74, U.S. Navy Captain Frank Alt undertook an investigation from July of '68 to November of the same that was published by the Navy in January of '69, called the Alt Report. Captain Frank Alt proposed what he called a womb-to-tomb approach. Start from how it's made and finish where it's unmade. Very simple.
It's physics.
So let's start at the beginning. The Phantom's dogfighting problems had a lot of different parts, but they started at the rules of engagement, particularly the one that required pilots to obtain visual confirmation of a target. To prevent friendly fire incidents, the all-knowing politicians of DC, and in turn the upper staff, ruled that engagements had to occur within visual range, although appears to be some evidence suggesting that this happened in response to a friendly fire incident from the Navy rather than in advance. But what about the Phantom's IRST? First of all, where did that voice even come from? You've been gone for a while and I did not miss you. Second of all, no aircraft the US Navy or Air Force had at the time, Phantoms included, could identify a target as hostile without visual confirmation, regardless of whether they were equipped with IRST or radar. As I mentioned in the last video, identification friend or foe technology wasn't available yet, and the IRST system carried by the F-4Bs just doesn't work that way. An IRST system receives infrared electronic emissions given off by an aircraft, or in simpler terms, the heat generated by the engine and the residual heat absorbed and emitted by the airframe from both the engine and the air friction. It's basically a heat-seeking missile seeker, but on a plane and without a missile. However, since it only receives emissions and not reflections of emissions like you do with a radar, not only can you not identify a target, you can't even tell the distance to it. All you get is a direction. It's more like a compass pointing out targets. To actually identify a target using IRST, you would need to have an onboard database of the exact heat frequencies frequencies emitted by a given aircraft, and the ability to compare them to the exact frequencies emitted by other aircraft, and that assumes they're all different enough to even notice a separable difference. The only reason we can tell aircraft apart on radar now is because the frequencies used by IFF transponders are different for the explicit purpose of identifying different aircraft, and a ton of intelligence, research, and experience went into identifying differences in aircraft radar signatures, and that's all still ignoring the computing power requirements they just didn't have back then. Here's your friendly reminder that your iPhone has more computing power than the Apollo 11 mission. IRST is basically just a radar with extra steps and less results. Consequently, it wasn't included on the F-4C and beyond because, considering the targets it was expected to face at the time, it didn't provide any meaningful contribution to the Phantom's abilities. The only reason they kept the bulb across other Air Force models was so they didn't have to make a whole new production line. They did eventually use that space for a radar warning receiver to detect things like SA-2 missile launches, but those Phantoms with IRST still in service did not have an identification capability that could bypass that rule of engagement. And without an identification friend or foe system, the radar couldn't do that job either, then requiring Phantoms to get into dogfights to finish the job. Not to mention, the MiGs would almost always stay low to avoid radar detection and use camouflage to blend in with the ground before picking out the Phantoms by their formations and their up to 30-mile-long smoking exhaust trails when they weren't an afterburner.
Then it's a dogfight.
And if you're in a fight, you gotta use the weapons, and the weapons on the Phantom were awful. And if we're gonna talk awful, we gotta start with the AIM-7 Sparrow. According to Steve Ritchie, one of the 5 US aces during the Vietnam War, and the only ace to score all of his kills with Sparrows, there were over 100 instances where a Sparrow missile was fired and it never came off the airplane. Captain Alt and his investigative teams found that 25% of these misfires were because the Sparrow was designed for a rail launch, not an ejection launch. Say it with me, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. See, the missile bays that were sunk into the Phantom helped to reduce air drag by covering some of the forward profile of the missile and, more importantly, its control fins with the profile of the Phantom. It's also more than likely that this was intended to store and launch the missile in such a way as to avoid its known issue where the mid-flight rotation from an X-aligned rail-mounted position to a cross-aligned flight position after launch would literally break the gyro it used for guidance. However, this change required the missile to be ejected from the plane before firing. So instead of using the circuitry in a rail to deliver targeting data to the Sparrow, that data was instead relayed to the missile via an umbilical cord that would reach out from the aircraft by about 10 feet before firing. After the war, when Germany received their Phantoms, they found out that on average, 1.5 Sparrow mounts just didn't relay any targeting data to the missile. And you couldn't tell any of this from the cockpit, so you'd have to go around and check every single one of the 4 mounts on every airplane every single time you ran your checklist on the ground like there wasn't a million other things to do. And when it did fire, there were a bunch of other issues that made the AIM-7E Sparrow's 71% results look like it cheated on the service entry test.
I don't cheat.
The radar-guided Sparrow missile was meant to intercept bombers at long range, and so it had features like a lockout range, or a minimum range that a missile will begin maneuvering at, of 3,000 feet. Getting into a dogfight and trying to use Sparrows on something like a MiG-17 was, in the words of Ronald Muggs McEwen, like being a giant with a long rifle trapped in a phone booth with a midget using a knife. Half the time you wanted to shoot this thing, you couldn't, because you were too far into the furball for the missile to guide, and then you would bring it back to base just to use it again, which sounds great. You don't use it, you keep it for later, right? Wrong, because the Sparrow missile is like a condom, you're only supposed to use it once. The AIM-7 wasn't designed for a scenario where it came back. It was supposed to survive one takeoff and put down a bomber. That was it. They weren't supposed to come back to base.
You could not live with your own failure. Where did that bring you? Back to me.
So whenever a missile did come back, it would keep getting subjected to more and more stresses that it wasn't designed for, like takeoffs, landings, and dogfights, and the freaking weather. The ocean is a maintenance nightmare for the Navy, and Air Force Phantoms usually wouldn't even take the missiles off the planes after they landed, leaving them exposed to humidity and monsoon rains. This would keep decalibrating the missile systems and break down the sensitive electronics. Then you'd have to send them in for maintenance, which the Navy would only do every 50 to 100 flights, while the Air Force at least had the decency to do it every 10 flights. However, both branches had their own issues with maintenance. The Navy, first of all, followed the classic military mentality of giving people things to fix that didn't know how to fix them.
So honestly, the task of describing it all to you is, not my fucking job.
The majority of the missile mechanics in the Navy were horribly undereducated on the systems they were working on, and combined with a lack of funding, spare parts, and detailed and in-depth maintenance procedures, the process of maintaining missiles turned out to be more of a patchwork repair process than actually replacing and upgrading broken bits and outdated parts. And this was a major issue because they would only send the missiles back for a rework every 270 to 296 days. That's about 2/3 of a year they would wait to replace the missiles that were only supposed to survive one of the multiple flights a day off the bustling carrier decks. If you're wearing the same pair of underwear 300 days in a row, you need to be quarantined to a landfill. I don't want to smell that crap. The Air Force had a different issue, which I cannot explain to save my life, because they had the budget to make whole calibration stations for their missiles, but not to buy trucks that wouldn't make their missiles rest in pieces. See, calibration stations were located pretty far away from the air bases, so the missiles had to be transported there by truck, where they would undergo calibration and be shipped back. Problem, they were moving the missiles back in bumpy, unpaved roads in trucks that didn't have suspensions. So you can imagine what shapes the missiles made it back in. But the other issues were based on the human factors of firing a missile, because it is complex. The switches in the cockpit for firing sequences were mounted lower down on the dashboard away from a more accessible center position. Because while the Phantom didn't need ground control intercept to guide them into a target, it was still pretty standard practice to rely on it. Once you actually got into combat, you would then need to drop a series of switches in the right order in the middle of a fight with a maneuvering threat. Worse still, the dashboard was supposed to indicate when a pilot was within firing envelope, but it was only geared for when a target was flying directly in front of them and straight and level, so that went out the window in a dogfight. And that's assuming the radar even worked, because according to the alt report, the F-4J's Westinghouse AWG-10 radar had a mean time to failure, or MTF, of 5 to 10 hours. Stop. Assuming each Phantom sortie lasts half an hour, that is 10 or 20 flights tops. And as one of the commenters brought up under my video reviewing the alt report, it could also be within as few flights as one. Thanks to the Air Force and Navy both using mid-air refueling, Phantoms could be airborne for several hours. That means it was entirely possible for an F-4J to go out on a combat air patrol with a brand new radar, refuel several times, and land back on the carrier in square one all over again with the radar being broken.
Oh, what are you doing?
What am I doing?
Thwarting my plans?
Sorting your plans?
Are you?
You know what? Yes!
Now let's assume for a moment that you actually got into position, you remembered the order of the switches and nailed them all down pat, the radar worked, the missile mount worked, and everything else is fine. You would then have to keep your target in front of you for a full 3.8 seconds for the system to fully lock on in a plane known to be less maneuverable than its targets, and then it took another 1.4 seconds for the data to feed to the missile and fire, for a total 5.2 seconds of lag on a missile shot. And you had an average of 2.2 seconds to actually take a shot. Then there was the Boresight lock, where you narrow the projected waves of radar to being centered off the nose in the same way as a gun sight. Since radars are designed to project energy in a given direction, a radar's output is also generally at its strongest along that direction, generally known as the Boresight, which should nearly guarantee a Sparrow lock and thus a kill. Sounds like a good thing to train pilots on, so they did, even though nobody tested it. Wouldn't you know it, early radars have early problems, and it turns out the radar beam was actually too narrow to keep a lock on the target. And despite 60 different attempts, the only successful kill via Boresight was achieved during Operation Bolo. And even then, if you got a firing solution after getting into position, remembering the switch order, and getting it right, the radar is working, the missile rail is working, and everything else is fine, the Sparrow would follow the radar beam to within about 60 to 90 feet of the target, with a missile fuse set to blow at 30 feet.
Are you kidding me?
Needless to say, the US was pretty fed up with this and started picking up more of the newer dogfight Sparrows, the AIM-7E2s, starting in late 1968, which used smaller fins to boost maneuverability and a plug installed on the ground to cut the lockout range in half. Unfortunately, Captain Alt knew that any modifications to the Sparrow were just that, modifications, and the Navy would need a new radar-guided missile built from scratch to fill the dogfighting gap. And he would be proven right almost immediately, since not only did the Sparrow's main issues show up with the E2s, but they also had a really weird habit where a third of them would just blow up 1,000 feet in front of your face. Consequently, the dogfight Sparrows would only rack up about a 12% success rate over the course of the war, with 34 kills for 281 E2s fired.
Damn, man, you couldn't hit the broadside of a space barn.
Yeah, well, that's only because I'm too busy hitting the broadside of your mom. Ah, my face!
Now, to be fair, those are still better stats than the 27 for 330 the original Sparrow E's had, but it's still not a great kill rate, especially since those were the only radar-guided missiles the US had for the whole war. Captain Alt had recommended that the AIM-7F model be delayed to prevent as many of those same core issues as possible, leaving the US with just the E's and E2s, as well as their closer range counterparts. The Sidewinder missiles are one of the most commonly known missile names today, and the primary reason for that is its performance in Vietnam. Despite the fact that it was probably the slowest air-to-air missile frame in service with the US at that time, it became the highest performing missile used by US forces during the war, with 82 kills across all models. The variants used up to this point, those being the B, E, and D variants, scored a combined 47 kills for a total 286 firings. These missiles suffered from similar internal issues, such as a guidance lockout time of the first 1.5 seconds of flight and a full lock taking about 0.8 seconds to complete. The earliest variant, the B model, also suffered from a short motor burn time, a limited amount of coolant for the heat-seeking head during lock-on, and hardware limits on the scanning angle of that seeker head, which meant that if a pilot was pulling more than 2 Gs in a turn, the enemy would be outside of the scanning angles of the seeker and the missile wouldn't lock at all, in a dogfight that normally takes around 7 to 9 Gs to pull. Then you mix in the heat reflections. These could come from the clouds, the sun, and especially the jungle after low-altitude flights became more common thanks to the threat of the SA-2s. After all of these factors, the B and E variants had a 16% hit rate and scored 29 kills for 187 firings, and the D variant had an 18% kill rate with 18 kills for 99 firings. And I differentiate between the two sets because the B variants, and especially the E variants, were used by the Air Force, while the D variants were exclusively used by the Navy. The split occurred for the same reason the Phantom was the only fighter used by both the Navy and the Air Force: standardization, or rather the lack thereof. See, the Sidewinder was the Navy's missile. The Air Force had contracted a different missile called the Hughes Guided Air Rocket, or GAR-1, which was renamed under the Tri-Service Designation System to the AIM-4 Falcon. However, the Falcon had a history, which many historians would describe as less than successful, and I will describe as absolute bullshit. It was originally made as a radar-guided missile for bomber interception, but it used a hit-to-kill warhead, meaning you had to physically hit the enemy plane with the missile hard enough to crumple the entire front half to set off the impact fuse and the warhead at the back of the missile. If you didn't hit the plane, congratulations, you failed. Insert credits to try again here. Even when Hughes adapted the Falcon into a heat-seeking design, the accuracy of this thing was so poor in testing in ideal conditions that a lot of Air Force aircraft ended up integrating the Sidewinder out of necessity onto platforms that didn't have bomb bays to store the sensitive electronics, like the F-100s, F-104s, and F-105s. The F-4C also used B and later E variant Sidewinders because they were a Navy plane first, and adapted it over time as improvements became required. But the Air Force never gave up on the Falcon program, not because they had faith in it, but because the branches of the military in the 50s were like spoiled kids at Christmas time. They each need to have their own stuff, and it has to be better than the other kids' stuff, or the US doesn't love them enough. The Air Force was using a Navy plane, they're using a Navy missile, they're getting stuck with the hardcore sharing, and it feels like they're the Bolsheviks. They won't stand for it, and like any spoiled child who would much rather be the Stalin in that equation, the Air Force looked for the first opportunity to have a game they didn't need to play on co-op mode. And when the D version of the Falcon missile came together as a high-speed, heat-seeking, dedicated anti-fighter variant, the Air Force decided to bet on it. And when I say bet on it, I mean they went all in.
All in.
The F-4Cs the Air Force already had were modified to carry AIM-4s by mid-1968, and the F-4Ds that arrived in Vietnam the year before had been exclusively designed for them. Despite the Sidewinder being a more tested missile, the F-4Ds had no built-in support for them, but you know, that's fine. The Sidewinder's easy to integrate onto an aircraft system, so that's how it got added to all the other planes. It's not a problem. Until the Air Force issued a direct order stating that using Sidewinders was completely forbidden across Air Force F-4s.
God damn it!
This is what I meant before when I said the Air Force tends to act like it's got a stick up its ass, although considering how bad the AIM-4 actually was, it was more like they used the whole tree. The AIM-4D was still a hit-to-kill missile, and it was stupid sensitive to the elements because it retained a lot of the original design shapes of its predecessors, which had been designed to be launched from the comfy weapons bays of the Century Series F-101, 102, and 106. And making matters worse was that landing a shot with this missile is like beating the world record time trial in Mario Kart. It was borderline impossible. The missile had about about a 2-minute window in which you could actually take a shot with it because of the limited liquid nitrogen coolant stored in the missile rails that you had to use to keep the missile seeker head from overheating and actually allow it to target things. And if you missed that window, your missile had to be sent back to a maintenance facility, again, far from base, to get it refurbished and then returned, probably uncalibrated as hell.
You're gonna fucking die. You're gonna die.
As if trying to beat Sonic the Hedgehog in a race with your coolant timer wasn't bad enough, the Sparrow wasn't the only missile to suffer from a human factors problem. See, the launch process for the Falcons was so complicated and had so many steps that the Century Series fighters that carried it had been given onboard computers to automate it. And you'll never guess what the Phantom didn't have. That's right, it didn't have the onboard computer, because the Phantom was a Navy plane that was designed for Navy missiles. So not only are the pilots having to get a firing angle in the amount of time it takes me to reheat my dinner in the microwave, they're also manually going through all the input steps while looking down in the cockpit while in a fight in the right order and on a 2-minute time limit. Honestly, I think you could make an argument that using the AIM-4 on the Phantoms was the inspiration for the entire speedrunning community. Somebody took one look at the launch process for the AIM-4 Falcon and said, "This, but video games, I want it." It was so bulky and distracting that one Air Force captain was quoted as saying that by the time you were ready to fire the AIM-4s, the enemy had already gotten around on you. Colonel Olds especially hated these missiles. He fired exactly 8 of them in combat, and the 8th time he did so, the missile tracked a MiG-17 perfectly, right up until the last possible minute, when it nosed up hard before snapping back down into the ground. He was so pissed off that the minute he landed, he took one look at his mechanics and said something to the effect of, "I don't give a damn what the chain of command says. The next time I fly that plane, I want Sidewinders on those rails," and ordered that every single ship in the 8th Tactical Fighter Wing be modified to carry Sidewinders. In fact, his exact thoughts on the matter were as follows. By the beginning of June, we all hated the new AIM-4 Falcon missiles. I loathed the damned useless things. I wanted my Sidewinders back. In 2 missions, I had fired 7 or 8 of the bloody things and not one guided. They were worse than I had anticipated. Sometimes they refused to launch, sometimes they just cruised off into the blue without guiding. In the thick of an engagement with my head twisting and turning, trying to keep track of friend and foe, I'd forget which of the 4 I had already selected and couldn't tell which of the remaining was perking and which head was already expiring on its launch rail. Twice upon returning to base, I had the tech rep go over the switchology and firing sequences. We never discovered I was doing anything wrong. However, because the Air Force was effectively pulling a Mark 14 torpedo and Bureau of Ordnance stunt all over again, the complaint department was out of business until people like Old set the tone that this crap wasn't cutting it. Only 51 AIM-4s were ever fired in Vietnam, with 5 kills and 1 probable, with 7 never leaving the plane for that 10.7% kill rate, which seems pretty good if you ignore the fact that the total number of missiles fired is a fraction of that of its counterparts. In practice, the use of the Falcon on the F-4 Ds and Cs probably had a highly disproportionate impact on the lack of scorable kills during this time period, because the US Navy primarily operated in the southern and coastal portions of North Vietnam. This meant the Air Force was always pushing northwards towards the more high-value inland targets that are, as should be expected, more heavily defended, meaning they were also taking the brunt of MiG engagements during that time without functional weapons, and getting in the ring like a boxer with 2 broken hands. By 1969, the Air Force had figured out this wasn't cutting it and fully retired the AIM-4 Falcons from service and swapped over to the AIM-9B and E models once again. And I say they figured out that it wasn't cutting it because I found a noticeable lack of information on the exact reason for the weapons withdrawal from service on the US Air Force's National Museum webpage and pretty much everywhere else I looked. So you know as well as I do, that means they finally realized dry humping a tree to pump their ego wasn't exactly the best battle strategy.
It's never gonna work on me, so all you're doing is making an ass out of yourself with this fake bullshit.
And before you say the gun was the answer, I want to say the same thing, but it wouldn't be completely accurate. I love my aircraft cannons in War Thunder. I'm a dogfight junkie and I usually rely on them. But the difference between a War Thunder player and an F-4 pilot in Vietnam is that the War Thunder player actually knows how to use the gun correctly. 9 times out of 10, inexperienced pilots would jam the cannon from firing for too long or just straight up run out of ammo trying to hit the much smaller and nimbler targets out in front of them. The Su-16 and 23 gun pods only had about 12 seconds of continuous fire, and the F-4Es had about half that with a smaller 640 round ammo pool stuffed in the nose. And while gun-equipped Phantoms had scored 1/7 of all Phantom tallies during Rolling Thunder, they would only rack up 6 more in 1972 for a total of 16 due to improvements in missiles and training. And speaking of training, F-4 Phantom pilots were horribly undertrained for air-to-air combat, and the training philosophies were different from branch to branch. The Navy would follow a pretty standard path of training up pilots from general flight training to specialization based on their designated plane. However, the specialized training for Phantom pilots still left out the dogfighting skills because it was designed as an interceptor and primarily relied on the AIM-7 Sparrows. The AIM-9s were a secondary weapon for the same purpose, but they were considered a backup measure because you could only lock them from the rear. The Sparrows could lock onto a target from more angles than just the rear, and dogfighting training was deemed unnecessary because the US thought you could just shoot down the enemy before they got anywhere near you. The only reason the Navy still had the tech tree option of the secret arts of dogfighting was because of their F-8 Crusader pilots and their Crusader core mentality. The Air Force, on the other hand, took one look at that tech tree and said, "F that tech tree. We're switching to specialists."
Oh man, I said the specialists were call the fucking cops.
The way the Air Force viewed pilot training in the 1950s and 60s was, to be blunt, a waste of time. In the words of historian Marshall Michael, quote, "The idea of splitting pilots by flying skill and pilot training was anathema to the bomber-dominated Air Force, because the Air Force refused to accept the idea that fighter pilots were more skillful than bomber pilots. The result was an Air Force personnel policy that said any pilot who graduated from pilot training was a universal pilot who could be trained to fly any type of aircraft." I'm trying to tell you that in the Air Force's infinite bureaucratic wisdom, they have decided that their best combat strategy is to turn their entire flying force into jacks of all trades and masters of none. This role might have worked out great for the A-37 Dragonfly pilots that got pulled from cargo planes and tankers, but for the high-speed F-4s dogfighting with MiGs, it was literally just putting the square peg in the round hole.
And you put it in the wrong hole.
The US Air Force would then proceed to shove the tree even further up their colon, because when Vietnam started, they'd put down a rule that no pilot could receive orders for a second tour unless they volunteered for it, until everyone in service had flown one tour. As a result, pilots were rotated out of theater every 1 year or 100 missions. 100 missions would usually take about 6 months, which meant that the Air Force basically needed a completely new pilot force every 6 to 12 months. Naturally, the snowball effect of that timetable then reaches pilot training, and suddenly the universal pilot idea seems a lot more practical, and you have to lower training standards to get more pilots in the door. Stop. I need you to grasp that for a minute here. They were letting in pilots who would normally have failed at being pilots and given them an airplane anyways. Can you imagine getting on a flight somewhere and hearing the intercom come on followed by, "This is your captain speaking, at least in name only, because I failed flight school and they still gave me a plane." You would get off that plane like the Roadrunner. This is the pilot equivalent of one of my favorite engineering jokes, where a bunch of engineering instructors got onto an airplane before being informed that it was built by their students. All but one of them run off screaming, and when asked why he stayed, the instructor calmly responds, "I have absolute faith in my students' abilities. I know for a fact this piece of shit won't even start." That guy is the US Air Force, and the engineers are the pilots. New Vietnam pilots were pretty much just by the book, because the book was all they had time to study. They had no ability to actually keep track of a fight and react to it. Colonel Olds in particular was not pleased with the quality of the new recruits coming in, stating, "I had learned to doubt the thoroughness of the combat training given to pilots being sent to Southeast Asia. Practically no one sent over had ever dropped real bombs, had made a max weight takeoff, or had fired his guns on an air target. The first time most of the replacement pilots ever saw a fighter loaded with live ordnance was when they arrived in Thailand. They hadn't a clue what they were looking at. I looked at them and said, 'Dear God, don't tell me there isn't a fighter pilot among you. This is the big league and you guys are not qualified. God damn it, why don't they send me some fighter pilots?'"
Who the hell do you think you are?
The Air Force did develop a system to familiarize their pilots to their new airframes, but the short time available and the pressure from shortages of manpower basically meant that it was just a cover story. Pilots would be familiarized with the Phantoms via a short light focused on mid-air refueling, formation flying, dive bombing, and a minimal amount of air combat. No proper facilities or programs had been stood up for a formal air-to-air combat training system, so all of what they got was half-baked at best, and thanks to a safety-first mentality that had been adopted by the entire United States after the Korean War, it wasn't nearly enough to catch them up. Captain Alt noted in his report that the requirements for safety were excessively confusing and convoluted, which is saying something coming from the government, and it resulted in most of the pilots being basically forbidden from actually figuring out air combat maneuvers and weapon systems. Air Air Force aircrews understood so little about the weapons they were using that 33% of the misses they experienced by Sparrow shots, 1/3 of all of their firings, were caused by aircrews who didn't realize you were supposed to keep the radar pointed at the target when you're hitting them with an A7. These were not AMRAAMs. You couldn't just fix a target fire and f*** off. The Sparrow was a semi-active missile, meaning it relied on the Phantom's radar to guide the whole way rather than its own internal systems. A lot of Sparrows fired during the war were also just fired from outside the weapon envelope because pilots just didn't know where they could and couldn't fire most of their missiles. Again, the firing envelope indicator they had in the cockpit didn't work. And for the heat seekers, 30% of all AIM-9Bs were fired from outside their weapon's effective range, a data point that was probably used as an excuse to usher back in the objectively worse AIM-4s. The weapons situation was a complete mess, so was the training, and it needed solutions. And that's where we'll leave off for now. Stay tuned for part 4 of the Phantom sometime in the next 2 weeks. Thank you for watching. If you liked what you saw, please consider checking out some of my other videos. You might like what you find. Until next time, dismissed.